Welcome to the 10th installment of Ear to the Ground, the Land Stewardship Project's audio magazine podcast. Ear to the Ground features interviews, reviews, and field reports related to sustainable agriculture, family farming, local food systems, and local democracy. I'm your host, Brian DeVore, editor of the Land Stewardship Letter. Ear to the Ground number 9 featured a discussion of how farming can produce multiple benefits beyond just production of food and fiber. What benefits for the environment, the community, and society in general can diverse farming systems produce? That's the main question the Multiple Benefits of Agriculture Research Project is exploring. It's become clear in recent years that farming's potential is just starting to be tapped. As we learned in the last podcast, a study of two Minnesota watersheds, Wells Creek in the southeastern part of the state and the Chippewa in the west, has shown that diverse farming systems that rely less on annual row crops and more on perennial systems such as pasture grass and hay can produce significant environmental benefits. In this case, the benefit that was produced was cleaner water, and those positive results can be attained on working farmland, land that is not idle, but instead is being actively farmed and is producing a viable income for the people who own and work it. But what does it actually mean to improve a watershed's aquatic health? Bruce Vondracek says it means quite a lot. He should know. Vondracek is an aquatic biologist at the U.S. Geological Survey's Minnesota Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. He is one of the scientists involved with the Multiple Benefits of Agriculture project and was one of the authors of a bioscience paper reporting some of the initiative's findings. Vondracek has long studied the impacts of farming systems on water quality and fish habitat. During the 1990s, he was a member of the monitoring team, a land stewardship project-led initiative that brought together scientists, farmers, government agency personnel, and environmental professionals to monitor the impact certain livestock production practices were having on the land and farmers. While working with the monitoring team, Vondracek realized that livestock and good water quality could sometimes go together, which is contrary to what he and other environmental scientists had been taught. His recent work with the Multiple Benefits of Agriculture project has reinforced what the scientists learned in the 90s. He has seen and documented how well-managed grazing systems can actually improve water quality on a farm. Vondracek recently talked about his research, why we should care how much eroded soil makes its way into our water, and how his attitudes towards the role livestock farming can play in improving the environment have changed. One of the things that I noticed when I looked at this study was the effect of sediment on fish and fish habitat. And I'm not sure if everybody really considers sediment. When they think of water pollution, they often think of chemicals, affluent from factories, that type of thing. But sediment can be a major problem for fish, and that's something that I know you've studied as a fisheries ecologist. And can you talk a little bit about that? How sediment itself can be a major problem for fish and their habitat and that whole chain there?
Yes. Sediment actually can have a number of effects on fish. At lower levels, sediment, and what I should really talk about here is that sediment is actually divided into two different categories. One is the suspended sediment, so the very fine particles that are carried along in the water and stay in suspension for a very long period of time. And then we also have sediment that moves along the stream bed surface, and there's consequences of either of those. But at low levels, sediment making its way into the stream can impair fish by simply impairing their vision, so that they can't see as well, so they can't see the other fish about them of the same species, nor can they see as well to feed. But as we increase the level of sediment, or as the level of sediment, suspended sediment in the stream increases, at higher and higher concentrations, what we eventually get to are levels high enough so that it actually starts to affect the uptake of oxygen, and it does that by actually acting like sandpaper on the gills of fish. So it starts to impede the process of uptake of oxygen, and at very high levels it actually does act like sandpaper, where it starts to erode away the tissue of the gills. Now, the sediment that moves along the stream bed itself affects fish habitat, and fish have a number of fish, let me put this a different way. A number of fish are very dependent upon having clean substrate in the stream bed to spawn. So they need clean gravels to lay their eggs, and then for the eggs to go through the process of maturing and then hatching. And what happens when sediment starts to increase is the sediment that moves along the surface of the bed, or when water slows down enough that the suspended sediment that I talked about earlier can actually settle out. What that does is settle then on the eggs and can actually smother the eggs. So it impedes the ability of the eggs to take up oxygen from the water. Now there's another consequence also and related to this, in that most fish in streams here in Minnesota depend, at least at one point in their life, on the invertebrates that live in the stream. So they use them for food. And the invertebrates are much smaller. They need to be able to move around in the rocks at the bottom of the stream. And if we get sediment moving along in the stream or along the stream bed, or to settle out on the stream, what that does is reduces the habitat for the macroinvertebrates, and then indirectly affects the fish, because there's less food for the fish to eat.
You know, kind of related to that, sediment can have, I assume, different effects on different watersheds, depending on their geography and the kind of land use going on there. And Wells Creek and the Chippewa are quite different. One's in the southeast part of the state and the other's in the western part of the state. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between them, I guess ecologically and geographically, and what that tells us by studying these two different watersheds? Can that tell us some things about overall what impacts our land use have on Minnesota or upper Midwestern watersheds?
Well, I'll go at this and briefly touch upon the geography, but talk about the ecological conditions. Wells Creek we picked for this project primarily because it is a cooler water stream and actually supports trout. And we think, from the best of our knowledge, that brook trout were found in Wells Creek prior to the settlement of this area by Europeans. And brook trout are pretty dependent upon cold water entering the system, and that's really related to the geography and the geology of the system. In the streams that enter into the Mississippi, where Wells Creek is, the area is underlined by karst topography, and what that simply means is that there's a lot of limestone, and that very low acid in the water actually eats away at the limestone and then allows water to move to the streams. And when it moves to the streams, it's cooler and supports a community that can include trout. Out west in the Chippewa system, we have much different geology, and the area does have some spring input, but not nearly to the level that we have in Wells Creek. And what that means basically for the fish and the invertebrate community is that the water is typically much warmer. And we have then out in the Chippewa and in Wells Creek two different kinds of fish and invertebrate communities. And it's primarily related to the temperature. And the important part there is that as opposed to we humans, fish really regulate their temperature based on what the water temperature is. They have no real control, as we do internally, to keep our body temperature at a certain level. So they're very dependent upon whatever the water temperature is in the stream. And we have broadly, not just here in Minnesota, but broadly across the world, different communities in cold water systems and in warm water systems as we have in Wells Creek and the Chippewa system. And there's also some other factors that go on here with the ecology, primarily related to the birds that move through, and that's much more related to the location of Wells Creek in relation to the Chippewa River, in that a lot of bird species move up the Mississippi River. And one of the differences and one of the reasons that we picked Wells Creek over Chippewa is that there is still more wooded habitat along Wells Creek. These areas are used by the migrating birds as they come up in the springtime to breed further north, and then in the fall when they move back. So we have both an effect on the fish because of the water temperature, and on the bird community because of the different kinds of vegetation that we have in each area.
Looking at some of the drops in sediment levels that we saw, like in Wells Creek, once we increased that amount of perennial vegetation on the ground, we saw a drop of as much as 84% in sediment runoff, and the Chippewa was 49%. I mean, it's kind of common sense tells you if you got more grasses and perennial vegetation on that land all throughout the year, you are going to have less runoff. But to have like an 84% drop or an almost 50% drop even, that seems pretty dramatic. Were you surprised at some of the drops you saw?
I was only surprised at the Wells Creek value, where we had a reduction in 84%. I was much less surprised with the reduction of effectively 50% in the Chippewa River system. And I would feel pretty confident that that 50% reduction in the Chippewa is a pretty accurate reflection of what likely would occur there. And that's really based on the model that we did. And one of the reasons that this model was developed originally, it was really developed to take a look at runoff and how different agricultural practices affect runoff. So what we saw based on these scenarios as we increased the vegetation in our modeling exercise, what we saw not only was a reduction in sediment, but we saw a reduction in the runoff levels. And that's important because runoff is the major mover of sediment across the landscape. So when we have rainfall and that then the rainfall can then erode the soil and then move it across the landscape. So by reducing the amount of water that was moving across the landscape, we came up with these different levels of sediment into the stream, and I'm pretty confident that that's correct. And the other part of this is that by having vegetation on the landscape, we reduced the runoff from based on this model, but just based on other research, vegetation on the landscape acts in many different ways to reduce the amount of runoff. One is that there's simply a physical barrier. So when you have more vegetation on the landscape, the stems of the plants, no matter what they are, even if they're grasses or corn stalks, if they're up, the vegetation itself acts as a physical barrier, slows down the water. That is important because then the water can infiltrate into the ground and not move across the surface, which then carries the sediment. The other part of having perennial vegetation is that we actually reduce the amount of water that makes it into the stream, whether it's across the surface or in the groundwater, because if we have lots of vegetation on the landscape, the plants are going to be taking up some of this water for their growth. They're going to transpire that back into the atmosphere, and so there's going to be less water moving through the system to the stream. So in both of these ways, sediment is going to be reduced.
That's great. You were involved with the monitoring project, which was the kind of the, I guess, precursor to this initiative and various other research initiatives that we've seen out there involving farmers and researchers like yourself. And I know one of the things that came out of the monitoring project and what seems to be coming out of the Multiple Benefits Initiative is this idea that working farms can actually play a pretty major role in improving things like water quality. That there's the idea that, well, if you put in a terrace or a grassy waterway, you can prevent further damage to the environment. And obviously, if you put the land set aside in a conservation reserve program situation or fallow, you can have a positive impact. But that we're actually seeing a situation where, say, with managed rotational grazing and some of these other systems, it seems that the farms can actually improve water quality, that the water can leave the farm in better shape than when it came onto the farm. Can you talk a little bit about that, what you've witnessed and how that, I guess, dovetails with some of this most recent research in the Wells Creek and the Chippewa?
Well, one of the things that you pointed out was the monitoring project, which actually began in 1993, so that was done quite a while ago. But one of the reasons that we really became involved, only one of the reasons, but one of the reasons we became involved in the Multiple Benefits Project is during that monitoring project, I and several other colleagues saw on several farms that had rotational grazing that when we compared rotational grazing or the water quality at or along rotationally grazed farms, compared that with farms that had conventional grazing, what we saw was, in most cases, an improvement in water quality, and specifically in the amount of suspended sediment that was in the stream, and I addressed that earlier on and how that can affect both the fish and the fish habitat. And one of the other things that we saw was that there was actually a reduction in the fecal coliform in the water in both of these particular situations. I'm not so sure that I was responsible for generating research that has been done since then, but there has been a number of projects since the monitoring project that have taken a look at managed grazing as a technique or as a managed grazing as a technique, but then compared that with other kinds of practices and then looked at water quality and the fish and macroinvertebrates in the streams. And there is research that is coming out that indicates that in many cases managed grazing, or rotational grazing as it's better known, has, or when that practice is incorporated, the water quality associated with those treatments is better in many different kinds of categories than what's found along conventional grazing. Now, I will say also, though, that managed grazing, although it improves if we had a system of permanent vegetation where cows weren't involved, we might get better water quality. So I'm not saying that managed grazing is the best use of the land as far as water quality goes, but what it allows is improved water quality and the ability of farmers to still make a living off that portion of land. So I think that's a very important consideration to weigh in our approach to water quality. And I might point out that there is some recent research that was done over in the last couple years by a colleague of mine at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency that for his PhD work where he specifically looked at managed grazing then in relation to conventional grazing and areas with no grazing. And what he found in a number of cases is that managed grazing actually fell out intermediate between conventional graze systems and no graze systems. So there was an improvement in not only water quality, but also to the physical characteristics of the stream. This gentleman I'm talking about is a hydrologist, and he's very concerned about how the stream system itself is affected by the change in land use. And he found that in many cases the physical system itself showed changes based on managed grazing. And I think because the system itself operates somewhat differently, that would then have feedback so that it supports the idea of improved water quality. So this actually is a feedback system and supports the information, mostly biological, that I collected a number of years ago.
Can you think back when you first started seeing that working farmland could have a positive impact on the environment? Were you, as a fisheries biologist, that probably wasn't what you were taught and trained, and were you surprised?
I came into this with a fairly open mind, but I will say that the information that was primarily available at the time when I started this project was that having cattle along a stream was going to lead to degraded water quality conditions. And my caveat there is that most of that work was actually done out west and not here in the Midwest. And the real difference out west is when we look at grazing out there, even what they call rotational grazing, that means the cows are on one spot for at least a year. And it's much more similar to our continuous grazing system here. But what we find out west is that the luscious vegetation is primarily along the stream courses, and the cattle, as you might suspect, spend most of their time there. Here in the Midwest, we're actually blessed with rainfall during the summertime, and yes, indeed, the cows will go to the stream and drink from it and eat along the stream. But because we have more continuous rainfall throughout the year, grass is greener here, not only along the stream, but uplands. And so, in one respect, I'm not surprised that we see a better or an improvement in water quality, even when we allow cows along the stream here in the Midwest, because grass grows pretty fast, and that has an effect on sediment, water movement, nutrient movement, some of those other things that we then consider important for water quality.
The Multiple Benefits of Agriculture project is now looking at how agricultural policy changes, university research, and market incentives can be used to bring about the kinds of diverse farming systems that produce numerous benefits for the land and our communities. For more on this initiative, see www.landstewardshipproject.org/programs_MBA.html. That's landstewardshipproject.org/programs_MBA.html. There you will find papers, articles, and graphics that tell the story of how diverse farming can have a positive impact on the fish in our streams, our rural communities, consumers, and more. You can send your comments, criticisms, and suggestions about this podcast to me, Brian DeVore, at bdevore@landstewardshipproject.org. That's bdevore@landstewardshipproject.org. You can also give me a call at 612-729-6294. A special thank you goes out to Laura Borgendale, a Western Minnesota musician and LSP staffer who provided Ear to the Ground's theme music. And a very special thank you to all of Land Stewardship Project's members who make initiatives such as this podcast possible. If you're not a member and would like to support us, go to landstewardshipproject.org to learn how to join LSP. Thanks for listening.